to the senator. We're anticipating about a 35-minute meeting. So we try to cover a lot of different things, but we may run out of time. So we appreciate your patience. We'll be starting here in just a few minutes, just waiting for the senator to join us. He should be here shortly.
We are patient. Okay.
Sally, do you have David working in the background?
Yes, I have him cleaning up.
Stacked all my papers on one chair and I gotta sort through them again.
I cleared out the table. It's like,
I'm glad to see you're putting them to good use.
I'm not muted.
We're, you got him unmuted? Senator, good to see you.
How are you?
We're doing fantastic.
Good. Thanks
We're
for
getting
doing
ready.
that.
We're going to get ready to start here in just a second. So we're glad. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm going to ask our chairperson, Sally Guetta, to make a few welcoming comments and then introduce you when we're ready to start. So Sally.
Okay.
Sure. Yes. Hi. Thank you,
Sally.
everyone. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for zooming in today. And a special thank you to you, Senator Cornyn, for making the time from your very busy schedule, especially now than ever, to join us. Also, thank you for your continued support for the business community and helping us get through this global pandemic, because I know we will get through this. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. For those of you, and I know the senator really doesn't need an introduction, but has been a tremendous supporter of the business community. He received his undergraduate degree from Trinity University, his law degree from St. Mary's, and then also an LLM from the University of Virginia. The senator started his public service career as a district judge, served on the Texas Supreme Court, Attorney General for the state of Texas, and then was elected as a United States Senator in 2002. He's up for re-election this year, seeking his fourth term. Those of you know Senator Cornyn, he's been a big supporter of South Texas, and I'm sure every region of the state would make the same comments. He's a huge advocate for the business community and for small businesses. And obviously the events that have happened in the last 4 or 5 weeks have really stressed the business community and the national economy. And so I want to turn it over to the senator. I want to thank you for taking your time to join us, and we'll look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you, Steve. You and I have been friends for a long time. I think starting when you were in Amarillo. Of course, you've now been in the Valley for a long time. Thanks for your leadership and friendship. And I want to thank all the local leaders like Mayor Darling and others. You know, that's one of the things that distinguishes our state from other states is the quality of leadership, not just at the state level, but at the local level too. And it makes all the difference. And this is not the first challenge that we've had, and it's not the last, but hopefully it'll be one of the last pandemics we ever have to see. This has really been a wake-up call and a shock, both from a public health standpoint and from an economic standpoint. Thanks to the McAllen Chamber for organizing this call, and I want to use my time here just to talk a little bit about what Congress has done to respond. I know I gave a little shout out to Mayor Darling, and if Judge Cortez is on the phone and on the video call, I want to recognize his leadership as well. I've been reading his tweets and the meetings he's been having to deal with this crisis as well. I'm eager to get back to South Texas, and as soon as things settle down a little bit here in Washington, D.C. But so far, Congress has passed 4 bills to bolster resources, first for our healthcare providers, and then to support workers and businesses who've been impacted by the economic fallout. Let me start with our hospitals. $175 billion for hospitals. This has been really a challenge for our healthcare providers because we've asked hospitals to forego elective surgery, which, as one doctor pointed out, he said, what's elective today may become an emergency later on. But we've asked them to forego that elective surgery, which is the way they pay the bills, so that we can maintain some surge capacity in case the number of coronavirus cases overwhelms our capacity. We don't want that to happen. That's the whole idea about bending the curve. But of course, we know there's a worldwide rush on for masks and gloves and other personal protective equipment. Literally every country, every state, every part of the world is trying to get access to this. And obviously we've learned a lesson that we can't depend on Chinese supply lines. That's going to be something that you'll hear a lot more about as we learn the lessons that this virus is trying to teach us. Once we obviously develop, we have clinical trials, about 72 clinical trials around the world for our treatment. And there've been, as recently as today, some promising results there. We just want them to get there as fast as they can, and then ultimately a vaccine. And ultimately, once we get a vaccine, then I hope we will relegate the COVID-19 virus to the same category we do seasonal flu. We know it disproportionately affects elderly people and people with underlying comorbidities. And so that's a good place to start when it comes to vaccinating the population. But the economic fallout of this virus has been just extraordinary. Businesses have had to shut down, as we all know. We can't gather in large groups and at football games or political conventions and the things like that. So we knew that the hospitality industry, for example, is going to be particularly hard hit, our restaurants or bars and hotels and the like. And frankly, many of the workforce work from paycheck to paycheck, and the minute they don't have a job, they don't have any money. And so we sent direct financial help to those who need it most. I consider this an economic lifeline. For example, a family of 4 with a household of an income of up to $150,000 will receive up to $3,400. The first payments have already begun to arrive, and hopefully all of that will be distributed here over the next week. We need to give people what they need to pay the bills, to pay for food, for their family, and for their rent or their mortgage. And that's what that money is designed for. Secondly, we've expanded unemployment insurance eligibility, as you know, and there's the Texas Workforce Commission has been absolutely crushed with applications and concerns there about delay. I know they are ramping up their ability to handle those applications. The good news is, if there is any good news, is that the benefits date from the date you lose your job and not from the date your application is approved. But here again, I know that's a source of anxiety and concern. And so hopefully those enhanced benefits will be useful, both to, we've expanded them to independent contractors and to some nonprofits. And we've extended them for an additional 13 weeks and applied a $600 federal benefit on top of the state's portion. So small businesses, we know, is what makes our economy so strong, and certainly that's true in McAllen. One of the things we hope to do is provide a lifeline to our small businesses, encourage them and incentivize them to try to maintain their payroll for their employees as a third way to try to help our workforce and to make sure that when we defeat the virus, that our jobs and our economies and our small businesses can bounce back. Well, we initially put in $350 billion, as you know. This was designed for cash flow assistance. This was hopefully to provide 8 weeks of that help. First, it would start out as a low interest loan, but then you could convert it to a grant, assuming you use it for payroll. And so this has been, of course, extremely popular. Less than 2 weeks after the lending began, the fund was exhausted. From the initial funding alone, Texas small businesses were collectively granted nearly 135,000 loans, 135,000, more than any other state. The total was $28.5 billion. Last week, we were able to finally add another $320 billion to this PPP program. And I think this is a great resource for our small businesses and their employees. And I'm glad that more small business owners will now be able to take advantage of it. Well, I know that we are looking at not locking down forever, but we want to do so safely. We want to come out of this safely. And we want to, and we've all been listening to guidance from both our local officials as well as Governor Abbott, as well as the President's task force. I was selected to serve on the President's task force to come up with an approach to reopening. And clearly there's not a one size fits all solution. I was amazed, just to give you some contrast with the impact that the virus has had on New York compared to Texas. And we obviously, New York has, I think, experienced 39% of the deaths from the coronavirus in the country, 39% just in New York. Texas, thankfully, is very, very small relative to that, but obviously any loss of life is a tragedy. But we know that human beings aren't made to live in isolation or in lockdown, and obviously our economy needs to start coming back. And we will do that gradually, very slowly. The way I see that is the governor has proposed about a 25% capacity. Many businesses will choose to stay locked down or stay closed down. But I know some of our restaurants, for example, who've been doing takeout and home and delivery will like to see it be able to add additional capacity. Of course, they may have to take out every other table or take other measures to protect their workforce and their customers. But gradually, I hope we can begin to come out of this. At the same time, we develop those treatments and ultimately a vaccine. But my purpose here is to get your feedback on what you think is working and what you'd like to see more of coming out of Washington. The Senate will be returning to session on Monday. The House has decided to wait a little bit longer. And of course, we're all thinking about what are the protocols we're going to have to establish, how are we going to manage maintaining that social distancing, and of course, along with good personal hygiene in order to keep that curve bent as we begin to return to some semblance of normalcy. So if you have any ideas, anything we don't cover here today, all of you all know Annie Garcia in my Harlingen office, and I'd ask you to reach out to her, and she can make sure your question or your concern is brought to the attention of the appropriate person in my office. So thanks very much, Steve, for organizing the call, and I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Senator. We have Mayor Darling on the phone, so I'm going to let him lead. Yeah, I've learned a long time ago, always let the elected officials go first. So
That's the key to your longevity, Steve.
it is. It is. Mayor Darling?
Well, thank you. And I try to get on with my picture, but it's not possible here at home. So I'm just on the phone. And Senator, I want to thank you for your leadership, not only in Texas, what you've done for us, but actually for the nation. And you're like a beacon of reasonableness, I got to tell you, when we look at what's going on in Washington. One of the things, and your staff, by the way, has done a great job locally keeping us informed and making sure that if we have questions, they get answered. So kudos to them, certainly. One of the questions I have is getting, some employers are talking about they can't get the people to come back to work because unemployment benefits are better than and better than what they're making, or almost similar to that. And then there's confusion about staying at home and those kind of orders. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, Mayor, I think honestly, we didn't want to incentivize people not to work. We wanted to incentivize them to work, and we messed up there. For some category of workers, you're right. They can, I think, if you make less than $8 an hour, you can actually do better with the unemployment compensation. The fact is, though, it lasts for 4 months, and so it's not a permanent benefit. And I hope we'll go back and anything else we do to help our workforce, I hope we won't incentivize people not to work, but rather incentivize them to work. We know that there's a lot of needs. Your sales tax revenue is way off because people have shut down their businesses and the like. We appropriated $150 billion for state and local assistance, and that money is just now getting out the door. We arbitrarily drew a threshold of 500,000 for the jurisdictions that could receive the direct money, but now I know Governor Abbott has gotten the rest of it's actually $11.2 billion for the state of Texas, and it was calculated essentially on a per capita basis. But the money that did not go to the larger jurisdictions, 500,000 and above, went to the governor. We know he's got it, and he's looking for Treasury guidance on how to distribute that. So please be in contact with the governor's office because I'm sure McAllen's going to want to make sure it gets its fair share of that money.
Yes, sir. And my understanding is, first it was going to go through FEMA, and we had, FEMA issues before because of the complicated formulas, et cetera. And my understanding is going to be on a per capita basis with the number of your population in your city. Will be distributed with 20% initially, and then maybe figuring out a more exact science after that. So we really appreciate that money. Just for your information, McAllen is going to be down about $28 million so far in revenues, which for a city our size is certainly significant. One other question, and it relates kind of the first question, is we have, packing sheds. We're the #1 produce importer of the Far Bridge in the United States, and we have a lot of workers in our produce industry that are minimum wage, and also some that use the V1 and V2 visa to get across the bridge to work in the produce industry. That's an immigration issue, I understand, but both of those are hurting. And with the talk about the meat plants being closed down, the last thing we need to do is have vegetables having a problem on the border. And if you want to, I don't expect an answer from you now, but that's really something that we need to address, as long as we're going to have the continued unemployment situation and also the lockdown on the border.
Well, yeah, Mayor, I'm very concerned about the meat packing plants, which got hit by the COVID-19, and many of them shut down. The president has now invoked the, what do they call it, Defense Production Act, I think it's called, basically designate them as critical infrastructure, but they're going to have to get the workforce back there safely with PPE, the personal protective equipment. But Andrew Cooper in my office, who helps me on trade issues and would be glad to ask him to contact you, or you could, he's available to you. Annie Garcia can facilitate that. But I hear you loud and clear. I know how important both the workforce and those fresh fruits and vegetables are to our food supply. So we'll certainly pay attention to that.
And certainly want to commend the Customs and Border Protection people for what they're doing on the bridge. You know, they're balancing safety with commerce, and I think they've done a great job on it. And, you know, we don't have being on the border, we don't obviously have an influx of problems with Mexico and what's happening over there. So I think a lot has to do with how CBP is handling bridge traffic. So kudos to them. And then lastly, I hope you encourage businesses. In Texas now, we have a no flare-up rule. We don't have the flatten the curve rule, so we don't want flare-ups. And I'd love to have you encourage businesses to continue to have their employees wear masks, maybe their customers wear masks. And because if we don't, we get past phase one, I think it's going to be even more important that we be careful and vigilant. And I know you have a lot of power in what you say to people, and so we hope you encourage that. Thank you very much.
Well, Mayor, that power does not extend to my home, but you're very generous. Yeah, we all have to do our part.
So, Senator, we have an aggregate question here that says that the PPP money went very fast the first round it went through, and there's concerns from several businesses here that this next round, this next tranche of money is going to go through fast, and again, they won't get the opportunity to apply for the loan. Is there going to be a third tranche on this, or is this going to be it?
Well, I think you're right. This has been a very popular program, and it's the money's going out quickly. But I think that's just indicative of the need for these loans and these forgivable loans. I think we've already gone through about the $320 billion. I think my staff told me today they'd already gone through about 50 billion of the 320 replenishment. So my advice would be to get your application in. And I know there've been some problems with large publicly traded companies that have access to credit using this program. And I know that the Treasury Secretary and the President have encouraged them strongly to give that money back, and many of them have done so. And so we know, though, that some of the larger businesses that have the professional workforce that can help them get to the money first, maybe got there before the mom and pops. But my hope is that the ones that we really wanted to throw that economic lifeline to can get in line quickly before this money runs out. It's hard for me to imagine that Congress would say after this money goes out that if there's still a real need that there wouldn't be anything more. But that's something we're going to monitor very closely, because you all can help me by telling me what your experience is there in the Valley, and that will help inform me and make it easier for me to advocate on your behalf in DC.
Thank you, Senator. Another question from Commissioner Joaquin Zamora was asking about opening up Mexico. Obviously, the economic tourists that come to McAllen, it's over $1 billion in retail sales that they provide for our local economy. How quickly do you think the border is going to open up to whatever the new normal is going to be, that we can get some of those folks coming from Monterrey and other parts of Mexico spending money here in McAllen?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and really I'm going to look to you all for your advice. I know that there's a lot of concern in conversations I've had with folks along the border about what's happening in Mexico and whether we have any insight into how they're handling this pandemic. Obviously, they don't have the infrastructure, the hospital system, the ventilators and things like that we do in the United States. And it may be that we're going to be called upon to help them pretty dramatically if, in fact, that it spins out of control. So I'm keeping an eye on that, and I would ask for your advice and counsel on what we need to do, because, as you point out, the supply chain and the food supply and everything else, we depend on each other. And I even talked to a couple of major car manufacturers who expressed concerns about the impact of the COVID-19 on their ability to continue to get car parts from Mexico. So we're keeping an eye on it. It's we don't have a whole lot of transparency there, and I don't have a huge sense of comfort that it's all under control. But I'm not sure I know enough to really make a recommendation on what we should do. So again, that's where I would welcome your advice and counsel.
Another question we have is, what are the lessons learned going through this pandemic? What are the lessons that you've taken away from this, and what do we need to do in the future to be better prepared?
Well, I've said to a group of Baptist ministers the other day when I was on the phone, I said, I think the number one lesson that God's trying to teach us is that we're not in charge, because certainly we're not in control of this. And but I do think in terms of supply chain, I mentioned PPE, the personal protective equipment. We need to be manufacturing that here in the United States so that we have a stable supply of that if something like this happens again, heaven forbid. We're also vulnerable on our medication. We depend on China. I think globalization has had many good things, and certainly the fact that China and other countries can manufacture things that we desperately need has been able to, it's come to us at a cheaper price. But I think we're going to have to look at maybe things like the opportunity zones that we did during the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act legislation to incentivize businesses to set up shop in the United States. And again, I think that's our relationship with Mexico is going to be an important part of that discussion, but also how we're going to have to learn a lot of lessons. And the most important lesson perhaps is going to be how to get countries like China to be transparent when they have a problem, rather than sit on the information and while the global pandemic unfolds. But I'm sure there's going to be many, many lessons that we'll have to learn from this.
This is an aggregate of several questions. So there have been several pronouncements for federal guidelines, state guidelines, and local guidelines from the president down to mayors of what people are supposed to do or not to do. And we're getting a lot of folks saying, okay, who am I supposed to listen to? And what guidelines am I supposed to follow? And so I'm interested in your response and hearing any suggestions that you'd have.
Well, I struggle with that as well, because it's hard to get good information. One thing I know you shouldn't depend on is social media for your information, because actually there are documented cases of disinformation campaigns coming from Russia and China and Iran. So Twitter is a lot of fun, and so is other social media, but I wouldn't rely on it for good advice. I rely on the Center for Disease Control, for example. There's a lot of questions about testing, who needs to be tested, and some of that is good advice, and some of it is kind of I think a little bit of a wishful thinking. For example, Center for Disease Control said that people with symptoms of the coronavirus should get tested. But they said, even if you have symptoms, if they're mild and you can ride it out at home, you may not need to get tested. And now we're hearing that this is perhaps the key to our solving this problem. But the truth is there are many different types of tests, and some of the ones that hold out the greatest hope for actually reopening our economy are things like antibody tests. But there's so many different tests that are out there, and now we're finding there are problems with reliability of some of them. And so to answer your question, I listen to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, who have become fixtures. I've listened to the Center for Disease Control. But I think given the nature and quality of your leadership there in McAllen, I think if you listen to the judge and the mayor, you can't go wrong.
Okay. Obviously with businesses reopening in Texas and obviously other parts of the United States, there's questions about liability exposure. So those that open up, they continue to follow CDC guidelines or state guidelines, and yet there's concern about them being sued if someone contracts COVID-19. Do you anticipate maybe federal legislation that would give immunity to businesses that are doing the proper things, but yet someone gets sick, because they come in contact with somebody in their store?
Well, I don't know if you caught it, Steve, but Senator McConnell was saying that there would not be another bill that did not have some protection from frivolous litigation. We're looking at a number of things, whether it's a number of different approaches, and obviously this is an impediment to people reopening. I mean, part of what, everybody knows how to manage risk in our lives, but this is really about fear as much as anything else and the unpredictability of it. And so that makes it harder for people to know how to operate. For example, the governor has said some movie theaters can open up and have 25%, occupancy. And some movie theaters perhaps will do that. Others say, no, we really don't feel comfortable doing it. So the government's not going to compel you to open up, but I know you want to know, have some predictability on what your liability is going to be. So the short answer is we haven't figured that out yet exactly. There were some similar protections in place after 9/11 and other tragedies like that. But that is really at the forefront of what I think we're going to have to do to get the economy open again to give employers and small businesses the confidence they can do so without exposing themselves to devastating litigation. That's one of our top priorities.
Good. I have a question in terms of there seemed to have been a moment of bipartisan effort and unity in funding and getting programs up and running dramatically quickly in terms of the PP program, the economic injury. Do you think we'll see that in the near future for the bipartisan effort, or was that just a moment in history?
Well, I think we did see our nation come together and rally like we have after other tragedies. I mentioned 9/11. I'm thinking about the great meltdown, the Great Recession of 2008. And I hope that continues. But you can't take politics out of Washington, D.C. and we do have an election coming up, believe it or not. And so at some point, I'm sure politics will rear its ugly head in this process. But right now, I think hopefully people are in a more of a problem-solving mode. And so far, we have been able to, for the most part, get our job done without the dysfunction that sometimes infects this place. So say a prayer for us.
Yeah, absolutely. We had another question about local government imposing curfews during their operations. And do you think that you see that as an overreach of their authority, or? Yeah.
I'm sorry, who?
The local governments, some local governments have imposed curfews, especially for teenagers. And, obviously it's hard to keep teenagers home. And so
right.
The question is that an overreach as far as local governments imposing curfews, or do you see that an infringement on freedoms that we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, there's no doubt that we are giving up some of our freedom for our mutual safety, but at some point there becomes a balance that's tough to strike. I think, as I understand the law, for the most part, the emergency authorities that the governor has can supersede some of the things being done at the local level. I guess you'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, but I think ultimately under our state constitution, the governor has that authority. Local officials can and should do what they think is the right thing based on local conditions. But I think finding that right balance is going to be tough, but would have to take a look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. We have a question from a local nonprofit that said they applied for the economic injury disaster loan program, but yet have not received any notification in the first round, have not received any notification from the SBA about their funding. They said they'll get something as an email, but they haven't received that yet. Is there anything? Yeah. Did they reach out to Annie or somebody?
Yeah, please. You're reading my mind. Yeah, just give their contact information to Annie. We'll run that down.
Okay, great. Well, Senator, I think we've come to our appointed time. We definitely appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to meet with us and have a conversation. Is there any final thing that you want to say before we sign off?
Well, Steve, the weather looks great. Is that a virtual background or is that reality?
I'm outside,
looks pretty good. In all seriousness, I just want to say how much I appreciate the chance to talk to you all through this Zoom meeting and share a little information with you. I've always found that in the midst of a crisis that Texans have a way of rallying together and helping each other. It's not all about what happens in Washington, D.C. or even what happens in Austin. But I just want you to know that we're doing everything I know how to do to help. And the entire Texas delegation is working very well together, as we always do, for Team Texas. But if there's things that you need, problems you see, just say something and we will be glad to take care of it. Anytime you do anything this big and this fast, there are bound to be some mistakes, bound to be some problems, but we're committed to dealing with it and adapting while we run this race to kill this virus and hopefully get back to some semblance of normalcy.
Well, thank you, Senator. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Senator.
We look
Thank
forward to
you.
working with you.
Thank you for all
Great
you
to be-
do.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.